And welcome. My name is Alan, and we are back with more Insurgent Mexico. Last episode, they arrived just at the border of the town where the battle had been taking place. And, yeah. But we'll be picking up and reading 2 more chapters. But, with that said, let's get into this. Chapter 8. The artillery comes up. Over to the right, along the base of the line of trees, heavy dust pillowed up. Men shouted, whips snapped, and there was a rumble and a jangling of chains. We plunged into the little path that wound among the chaparral and emerged upon a tiny village lost in the brush near the ditch. It was strikingly like a village, it was strikingly like a Chinese or Central American village. 5 or 6 adobe huts thatched with mud and twigs. It was called San Ramon, and there was a little struggling knot of men swayed about every door, clamoring for coffee and tortillas and having fiat money. The Pacificos squatted in their tiny corrals, selling macuche at exorbitant prices. Their women sweated over the fire, hammering tortillas and pouring villainous black coffee. All around in the open spaces lay sleepers like the dead, and men with bloody arms and heads tossing and groaning. Presently an officer galloped up and streaked with sweat and screamed, "Get up, you fools! Pendejos! Wake up and get back to your companies! We're going to attack!" A few stirred and stumbled, cursing to their weary feet, and others still slept. "Hijo de la!" snapped the officer and spurred his horse upon them. Trampling, kicking, the ground boiled, men scrambling out of the way and yelling. They yawned, stretched, still half asleep, and sifted off slowly toward the front in an aimless way. The wounded only dragged themselves listlessly to the shade of the brush. Along the side of the ditch went a sort of wagon track, and up to this Constitutionalist artillery were arriving. One could see the gray heads of the straining mules and the big hats of their drivers, and the circling whips. The rest was masked in dust. Slower than an army, they had been marching all night. Past us rumbled the carriages and caissons. The long, heavy guns, yellow with dust. The drivers and gunners were in fine good humor. One, an American, whose features were absolutely indistinguishable in the all-mantling mud of sweat and earth, shouted to know if they were in time or if the town had fallen. I answered in Spanish that there were lots of Colorados yet to kill, and a cheer ran along the line. "Now we'll show them something," cried a big Indian on a mule. "If we could get into their cursed town without guns, what can we do with them?" The Alamos ended just beyond San Ramon, and under the last trees, Villa, General Angeles, and the staff sat on horseback at the bank of the ditch. Beyond that, the ditch ran naked across the naked plain into the town, where it took water from the river. Villa was dressed in an old brown suit without a collar and an ancient felt hat. He was covered with dirt and had been riding up and down the lines all night, but he bore no trace of fatigue. When he saw us, he called out, "Hello, muchachos! Well, how do you like it?" "Fine, mi general." We were worn out and very dirty. The sight of us amused him profoundly. He never could take the correspondence seriously anyway, and it seemed to him very droll that an American periodical would be willing to spend so much money just to get the news. "Good," he said with a grin. "I'm glad you like it, because you're going to get all you want." The first gun had now come opposite the staff and unlimbered, the gunners ripping off the canvas covers and tilting up the heavy caisson. The captain of the battery screwed on the telescopic sight, and the crank of the raising lever spun. The brass butts of the heavy shells shone in gleaming rows. Two men staggered under the weight of one and rested it on the ground while the captain regulated the shrapnel timer. The breech lock crashed shut and we ran far back. Kraboom! Shock! A soaring, whistling pew flew high after the shell, and then a tiny white smoke flowered at the foot of the Cerro de la Pila, and minutes later a far detonation, about 100 yards apart, in all along in front of the guns. Picturesque, ragged men stared motionless through their field glasses. They burst into a chorus of yells. "Too low! Too far to the right!" Their guns are all along the ridge. Time it! About 15 seconds later. Down front, the rifle fire had frittered away to ragged sputtering, and the machine guns were silent. Everybody was watching the artillery duel. It was about 5:30 in the morning and already very hot. In the fields behind sounded the parched chirp of crickets. The lofty, fresh tops of the alamos rustled in a high, languid breeze. Birds began to sing again. Another gun wheeled into line, and the breech lock of the first clacked again. There came the snap of the trigger, but no roar. The gunners wrenched back on the breech and hurled the smoking brass projectile on the grass. Bad shell. I saw General Angeles in his faded brown sweater, hatless, peering through the sight and cranking up the range. Villa was spurring his reluctant horse up to the caisson. Crab! Boom! Shock! Pew! The other gun this time. We saw the shell burst higher up the stony hill this time, and then 4 booms floated to us, and simultaneously the enemy shells, which had been exploding desultorily over the line of trees nearest the city, marched out into the open desert and leaped toward us in 4 tremendous explosions much nearer. More guns had wheeled into line. Others fired off to the right along the diagonal of trees, and a long line of heavy trucks, plunging mules, and cursing. Shouting, then men choked up the dusty road to the rear. They unlimbered mules, jingled back, and the drivers threw themselves exhausted under the nearest chaparral. The Federal shrapnel, well fired and excellently timed, was bursting now only a few hundred yards in front of our line, and the minute boom of their guns was almost incessant. Crash! Whee-ah! Over our heads, snapping viciously in the leafy trees, sang the rain of lead. Our guns replied spasmodically. The homemade shells fashioned on converted mining machinery in Chihuahua were not reliable. Galloped past stout Captain Marinelli, the Italian soldier of fortune, steering as near the newspaperman as possible, with a serious Napoleonic look on his face. He glanced once or twice at the cameraman, smiling graciously, but the latter coldly looked away. With a workman-like flourish, he ordered the willing of his gun into position and sighted it himself. Just then a shell burst deafeningly about 100 yards in front. The Federals were getting the range. Marinelli bounded away from his cannon, mounted his horse, limbered up, and came galloping dramatically back with his gun rumbling along at a dead run behind. None of the other guns had retreated. Pulling up his foaming charger in front of the cameraman, he flung himself to the ground and took a position. "Now," he said, "you can take my picture." "Go to hell," said the cameraman, and a great shout of laughter went up along the line. The high, cracked note of the bugle thrilled through the racking roar. Immediately, mules dragging their jangling limbers appeared, and shouting men. The caissons snapped shut. "Going down front," shouted Colonel Servin. "Not hitting, not too far away here." And the long-halted line snapped taut and wound out into the desert under the bursting shells. Chapter 9. Battle. We returned along the winding path through the mesquite, crossed up the torn-up track, and struck out across the dusty plain southeastward. Looking back along the railroad, I could see smoke in the round front of the first train miles away, and in front of it throngs of active little dots swarming on the right of the way, distorted like things seen in a wavy mirror. We strode along in the haze of thin dust. The giant mesquite dwindled until it scarcely reached to our knees. To the right, the tall hill and the chimneys of the town swam tranquilly in the hot sun. Rifle fire had almost ceased for the moment, and only dazzling bursts of thick white smoke marked our occasional shells along the ridge. We could see our drab guns rocking down the plain, spreading along the first line of alamos, where the searching fingers of the enemy shrapnel probed continually. Little bodies of horsemen moved here and there over the desert, and stragglers on foot trailing their rifles. An old peon, stooped with age and dressed in rags, crouched in the low shrub gathering mesquite twigs. "Say, friend," we asked him, "is there any way we can get in close to see the fighting?" He straightened up and stared at us. "If you had been here as long as I have," said he, "you wouldn't care about seeing the fighting. Caramba! I've seen them take Torreon 7 times in 3 years. Sometimes they attack from Gomez Palacio, and sometimes from the mountains. But it is always the same. War. There is something interesting in it for the young, but for us old people, we are tired of war." He paused and stared out over the plain. "Do you see this dry ditch? Well, if you get down in it and follow along, it will lead you into the town." And then, as an afterthought, he added incuriously, "What party do you belong to?" "The Constitutionalists." "So, first it was the Maderistas, and then the Orozquistas, and now the, what did you call them? I'm very old, and I have not long to live, but this war, it seems to me that all it accomplishes is to let us go hungry. Go with God, senores." And he bent again to his slow task, while we descended into the arroyo. It was a disused irrigation ditch running a little south of west, its bottom covered with dusty weeds, and at the end of its straight length hidden from us by a sort of mirage that looked like a glaring pool of water. Stooped a little, so as to be hidden from the outside, we walked along, it seemed, for hours, and the cracked bottom and dusty sides of the ditch, reflecting the fierce heat upon us until we were faint with it. Once horsemen passed quite near on our right, their big iron spurs ringing. We crouched down until they passed, for we didn't want to take any chances. Down in the ditch, the artillery fire sounded very faint and far away. But once I cautiously lifted my head above the bank and discovered that we were very near the first line of trees. Shells were bursting along it, and could even see the belch of furious haze hurling out from the mouths of our cannon, and feel the surf of sound waves hit me like a blow when they fired. We were a good quarter of a mile in front of our artillery, and evidently making for the water tank on the very edge of the town. As we stooped again, the shells passing overhead whined sharply and suddenly across the arc of the sky, and were cut off abruptly until the sullen, echoless boof of their explosion. There ahead, where the railroad trestle of the main line crossed the arroyo, huddled a little pile of bodies, evidently left from the first attack. Hardly one was bloody. Their heads and hearts were pierced with the clean tiny hose of steel Mauser bullets. They lay limply with the unearthly calm, lean faces of the dead. Someone, perhaps their own thrifty compañeros, had stripped them of arms, shoes, hats, and serviceable clothing. One sleeping soldier, squatting on the edge of the heap with his rifle across his knees, snored deeply. Flies covered him. The dead hummed with them, but the sun had not yet affected them. Another soldier leaned against the townward bank of the ditch, his feet resting on a corpse, banging methodically away at something he saw. Under the shadow of the trestle, 4 men sat playing cards. They played listlessly, without talking, their eyes red with lack of sleep. The heat was frightful. Occasionally a stray bullet came by screaming, "Where is ye?" This strange company took our appearance as a matter of course. Their sharpshooter doubled up out of the range and carefully put another cartridge clip in his rifle. "You haven't got another drop of water in that canteen, have you?" he asked. "Addio! We haven't eaten drunk since yesterday. He guzzled the water furtively, watching the card players lest they too should be thirsty. They say that we are to attack the water tank and the corral again when the artillery is in position to support us. Chihuahua hombre. But it was duro in the night. They slaughtered us in the streets there. He wiped his mouth on the back of his hand and began firing again. We lay beside him and looked over. We were about 200 yards from the deadly water tank. Across the track and the wide street beyond lay the brown mud walls of the Brittingham Corral, innocent looking enough now, with only black dots to show the double line of loopholes. There are the machine guns, said our friend. See them? Those slim barrels peeping over the edge? We couldn't make them out. Water tank, corral, and town lay sleeping in the heat. Dust hovered still in the air, making a thin haze. About 50 yards in front of us was a shallow exposed ditch, evidently once a federal trench, for the dirt had been piled on our side. 200 drab, dusty soldiers lay in it now, facing townward and the Constitutionalist infantry. They were sprawled on the ground in all attitudes of weariness, some sleeping on their backs, facing up to the hot sun, others wearily transferring the dirt with their scooped hands from rear to front. Before them, they had piled up irregular heaps of rock. Now, infantry in the Constitutionalist army is simply cavalry without horses. All Villa's soldiers are mounted, except the artillery and those from whom horses cannot be procured. Of a sudden, the artillery in our rear boomed altogether, and over our heads a dozen shells screamed toward the cerro. "That is a signal," said the man at our side. He clambered down into the ditch and kicked the sleeper. "Come on," he yelled. "Wake up! We're going to attack the pelones." The snorer groaned and opened his eyes slowly. He yawned and picked up his rifle without a word. The card players began to squabble about their winnings. A violent dispute broke out as to who owned the pack of cards. Grumbling and still arguing, they stumbled out and followed the sharpshooter up over the edge of the ditch. Rifle fire sprang along the edge of the trench in front. The sleepers dropped over on their stomachs behind their little shelters. Their elbows worked vigorously, pumping the guns. The hollow steel water tank resounded to the rain of bumping bullets. Chips of adobe flew from the wall of the corral. Instantly, the wall bristled with shining barrels, and the two awoke crackling with hidden vicious firing. Bullets roofed the heavens with whistling steel, drummed the smoking dust up until a yellow curtain of whirling cloud veiled us from the houses and the tank. We could see our friend running low along the ground, the sleepy man following, standing erect, still rubbing his eyes. Behind, strung out the gamblers, squabbling yet. Somewhere in the rear, a bugle blew. The sharpshooter running in front stopped suddenly, swaying as if he had run against a solid wall. His left leg doubled under him, and he sank crazily to one knee in the exposed flat, whipping up his ride with a yell. "Blank, blank, blank, the dirty monkeys!" he screamed, firing rapidly into the dust. "I'll show the blank! The cropped heads! The jailbirds!" He shook his hand impatiently like a dog with a hurt ear. Blood drops flew from it. Bellowing with rage, he shot the rest of his clip and then slumped into the ground and thrashed to and fro for a minute. The others passed him with scarcely a look. Now the trench was boiling with men scrambling to their feet like worms when you turn over a log. The rifle fire rattled shrilly. From behind us came running feet. The men in sandals with blankets over their shoulders came falling and slipping down the ditch and scrambling up the other side, hundreds of them it seemed. They almost hid from us the front, but through the dust and the spaces between running legs, we could see the soldiers in the trench leap their barricade like a breaking wave. And then the impenetrable dust shut down, and the fierce stabbing needle of the machine guns sewed the mighty jumble of sounds together. A glimpse through a rift in the cloud, torn by a sudden hot gust of wind. We could see the first brown line of men reeling together like drunkards, and the machine guns over the wall spitting sharp, dull red in the sunshine. Then a man came running back out of it, the sweat streaming down his face without a gun. He ran fast, half sliding, half falling, down into our ditch and up the other side. Our dim forms loomed up in the dust ahead. "What is it? How is it going?" I cried. He answered nothing, but ran on. Suddenly and terribly, the monstrous crash and scream of shrapnel burst from the turmoil ahead. "The enemy's artillery!" Mechanically, I listened for our guns. Except for an occasional boom, they were silent. Our homemade shells were failing again. 2 more shrapnel shells. Out of the dust cloud men came running back, singly, in pairs, in groups, a stampeding mob. They fell over us, around us, drowned us in a human flood, shouting, "To the Alamos! To the trains! The Federation is coming!" We struggled up among them and ran straight up the railroad track. Behind us roared the shells, searching in the dust and the tearing musketry. And then we noticed that all the wide roadway ahead was filled with galloping horsemen, yelling shrill Indian cries and waving their rifles. The main column. We stood to one side as they whirled past, about 500 of them, watched them stoop in their saddles and began to shoot. The drumming of their horses' hooves was like thunder. "Better not go in there. It's too hot," cried one of the infantry with a grin. "Well, I'll bet I'm hotter," answered a horseman, and we all laughed. We walked tranquilly back along the railroad track until the firing behind wound up to a continuous roar. A group of peons, pacificos, in tall sombreros, blankets, and white cotton blouses, stood along there with folded arms, looking down the track toward town. "Look out here, friends," joshed a soldier. "Don't stand there, you'll get hit." The peons looked at each other and grinned feebly. "But, senor," said one, "this is where we always stand when there is a battle." A little further along I came upon an officer, a German, wandering along, leading his horse by the bridle. "I cannot ride him any more," he said to me earnestly. "He is quite too tired. I am afraid he will die if he does not sleep." The horse, a big chestnut stallion, stumbled and swayed as he walked. Enormous tears trickled down his half-shut eyes and rolled down his nose. I was dead tired, reeling from the lack of sleep and food and the terrible heat of the sun. About half a mile out, I looked back and saw the enemy's shrapnel poking into the line of trees more frequently than ever. They seemed to have thoroughly got the range, and just when I saw the gray line of guns limbered to their mules began to crawl out of the trees toward the rear at 4 or 5 different points. Our artillery had been shelled out of their positions. I threw myself down to rest in the shade of a big mesquite bush. Almost immediately a change seemed to come in the sound of the rifle fire, as if half of it had been suddenly cut off. At the same time, 20 bugles shrilled. Rising, I noticed a line of running horsemen fleeing up the track, shouting something. More followed, galloping at the place where the railroad passed beyond the trees on its way into town. The cavalry had been repulsed. All at once, the whole plain squirmed with men, mounted and on foot, all running rearward. One man threw away his blanket, another his rifle. They thickened over the hot desert, stamping up the dust until the flat was crowded with them. Right in front of me, a horseman burst out of the brush, shouting, "The Federals are coming! To the trains! They are right behind!" The entire Constitutionalist army was routed. I caught up my blanket and took to my heels. A little way farther on, I came to a cannon abandoned in the desert. Traces cut, mules gone. Underfoot were guns, cartridge belts, and dozens of sorapes. It was a rout. Coming to an open space, I saw ahead a large crowd of fleeing soldiers without rifles. Suddenly, 3 men on horseback swept across in front of them, waving their arms and yelling, "Go back!" they cried. "They aren't coming out! Go back, for the love of God!" 2 I didn't recognize. The other was Villa. But we'll go ahead and end this episode there. So, yeah. Looks like the Constitutionalists, they tried a charge and were highly unsuccessful. Yeah. And our reporters observing all this. Jeez. Just thinking when you could push them back enough and could move forward. Nope, here they come. So yeah. It is interesting to see just how much the battle itself is changing. You know, before it was just guns and guns and guns and guns. Now, there's artillery, horsemen. Crazy. But, yeah. It appears Villa's forces, the Constitutionalist forces, are being routed and forced to flee. And Villa's like, "No! Stop! Go back!" But yeah. But with that, we'll go ahead and end this episode there. As always, Educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.